The next assembly we're going to discuss is the Mueller series. They make a double check assembly in the model H9505, produced in sizes 4 through 10 inch, produced from about 1975 to 1988. Cast iron body, made a couple different versions over the years. A galvanized coating and painted epoxy was the most common one they used. Serial numbers were needed to order some repair parts on this assembly, but the bottom line is there are no more rubber parts available. So if you have the H9505 double check or the H9506 reduced pressure principal assembly, rubber parts are no longer available. But I want to show you what it looks like. Let's go ahead and take a look at the breakdowns on it. The double check version has check valves pointing up at about a 45-degree angle, inlet check here, second check over here, outlet gate valve, inlet gate valve. Single access cover for each check valve, meaning each cover has its own, or each check has its own cover. Spring was contained for the when you disassemble it, so the spring would be contained when the cover came off. Spring tension did not have to be released for the average repair. Here's a cutaway of the RP version. The relief valve was mounted underneath the check body. You can see a little breakdown picture right there on the side, and here's a larger view of it. The relief valve body had to be dropped from the check body for the repair, and this part where the assembly bolt was had to be unscrewed, and this part pulls off, which I can show you a relief valve and see what it looks like. This is the H9506. Let's take a look at some of the parts just to see what they look like, even though rubber parts are no longer available. Here's the check mechanism out of a 4-inch, and one bolt holds the disc into the disc holder. Spring tension was contained for the average repair and didn't have to be released. It was easy to identify because they were unique. They had a 3-fingered guide on the disc holder of the check assemblies. The relief valve caused a lot of trouble because it was a relatively complicated relief valve, and actually it was very similar to the clay valve model CDHS-14, which had the 3 different bellow frames. But once you had this dropped off the body, this outer section had to be unscrewed, which in high pressure sensing line, so it could be disassembled. Assembly bolts here, assembly bolt in the middle. And anyway, that's the Mueller's relief valve that they utilized for that one. Very similar, as I said, to the clay valve CDHS-14. Since rubber parts are no longer available, this is what it looks like, though, if you ever see one. And that's the Mueller RP or double check version H9505 and H9506 backflow assemblies. You may run across some backflow assemblies with the name tag Neptune on them. Specifically in the double check, you may see a 550 reduced pressure assembly 575. You may see pressure vacuum breakers model 720, 701, or 711. Neptune made these assemblies, and the the pressure vacuum breakers 720, 701, and 711 they purchased from the SMR, or Surgical Mechanical Research Company. They made them for a while, but they sold them off to a company that bought them out, which was Wilkins, who bought them with the 550 and 575. So on the pressure vacuum breakers 701, 711, 720, you may see SMR, you may see Neptune, and it's currently produced the 720 version under the Wilkins name. The model 550 and 575 you may see under the Neptune name, or you might see it under Wilkins, who produced it for a time period before they discontinued it on new models. Anyway, Neptune did make backflow assemblies in those models. To see the corresponding version of it, you can see the Wilkins assemblies and the SMR version, and SMR versions for the PVB. The next assemblies we're going to discuss are the Orion series. We'll talk about this in some specific sizes and models. The first is the model BDC, which was their double check assembly, produced in sizes 3/4, 1, 3-inch, and 4-inch. Originally it was produced under the Toro name, and Toro began making them originally and then sold to Orion later on. And Orion produced them for a while and actually sold them off to BAVCO. BAVCO bought them in about 2000, 2001-ish area and they never actually sold them under the BAVCO name, but BAVCO bought the rights to it from Orion and discontinued production of it. The RP version was known as the model BRP. Same sizes, 3/4, 1, 3, and 4-inch. Here's the BDC in sizes 3/4 and 1-inch. It was unique in that it had an up and down piping configuration. In other words, water came up from the bottom, went through the canisters, through the top, and back down through the bottom. They had an integral ball valve that was built into the body, so the shutoffs were a ball valve shutoff built into the body itself. The BRP, same thing, up and down piping, the side view of it. You can see the relief valve off to the side of that unit. The 3 and 4 inch had that same up and down piping configuration as we saw in the small 3/4 and 1 inch. The canisters, instead of being out of plastic like the 3/4 and 1, the 3 and 4 inch were a stainless steel canister here with a brass top and a brass base that it was built to, with the long studs going between it to hold it together. The RP version had the relief valve mounted to the side of the check body. It looks like it was mounted to the gate valve, but it was actually mounted to a little bushing on the top here, just below the test cock on the body itself. But anyway, relief valve was mounted on the side here. The same canisters that we saw in the 3 inch, so the 3 and 4 inch had that. Access off the top to the check assemblies, relief valve cover from the side. Rubber parts are no longer available, but let's take a look and see what they look like just so we know. Here's a cutaway version of the BRP. You can see the cutaway of the check some here, but the main thing I want to show you in these ball valves, these were the shutoffs for that unit. They were built into the backflow assembly itself, the integral ball valves. The relief valve was mounted off to the side, as you see here, with a stainless steel clamp is how it was disassembled. But to disassemble this unit, they're on 3/4 and 1, there were 2 bolts on the top. Take the 2 bolts off, nuts, excuse me. Cover would come off from the top. First check assembly with the relief valve attached, second check assembly like this. Top part was the check seat. Check assembly, 1 screw held the disc into the disc holder. Reassembly was just the reverse, but since there are no more rubber repair parts available, that's where I wanted to show you what it looked like. That's the 3/4 and 1 inch model BRP. Here's the 3 and 4 inch relief valve assembly. Instead of the stainless steel clamper on the outside, it did have the bolts. It was attached by bolts to the check body with an O-ring seal. But I wanted to show you the checks because they're kind of unique. Here's those cans that I showed you in the picture, and the check assembly just comes out of the middle of it like this. This being a 3 inch and this being a 4 inch. 4 inch was very simple, contained spring. Remove those bolts, change the check disc, but the 3 inch offered some very interesting properties. In other words, this is the check mechanism, and what it used to utilize was an extension spring that stretched across between these 2 points. Now, we've all heard for years that there has to be a heavier spring on the first check than the second check of an RP. That is not true. The correct term is there has to be a heavier spring load on the first check of an RP than the second check. This is the one backflow assembly that had the exact same spring in the first check as it did in the second check, and it had an extension spring. But what they used to do was, whether it was a first check, they would have a larger cam, second check would have a smaller cam. And what that meant is that with the second check, it would stretch a little bit, but with the first check cam, it stretched it a lot more. So kind of a little footnote of history is that here's one RP that had the same springs in the first check and the second check, but how it achieved a different spring load was by the cams. And that's our Orion BDC and BRP reduced pressure assembly. Rubber parts are no longer available. Next assemblies we're going to discuss from the Orion manufacturer is the model 80-0069 and 9-29 reduced pressure assemblies. Orion in the sizes 1.5 inch and 2 inch had a separate model number for each model. In other words, the 9-2929 was a 2 inch, 80-069 was the 1.5 inch. The double check models were the 80-070 and the 9-2930. Production was originally begun with the Toro name. Toro made this first and then sold it to Orion, and Orion produced it. They made it for a few years and sold it off to BAVCO around 2000-ish, 2001, somewhere around there, and BAVCO did not make repair parts for them. So once they bought them from Orion, rubber parts were discontinued that Orion had produced. This series had a very unique design. Just like the 3/4 1 inch, water came up from the bottom through the and came out through the other side. Didn't have an integral ball valve, but had gate valves that were mounted by a clamp on the bottom. There's a single bolt that attached this clamp bolt that held the 2 shutoff valves to the base of the backflow assembly. This was before the requirement for a ball valve or resilient seated shutoffs, although these were a resilient seated gate valve, but they did not hold pressure very well. The problem became if you ever had to change shutoffs on this, you'll see a lot of people would put a secondary shutoff before this because this clamp that was on the edge of this shutoff was adapted to hit into that backflow assembly, and you couldn't easily just change this gate valve without changing that. So a lot of people left this bad gate valve in here and would put a secondary one before or after, depending what they were changing. Stainless steel clamp held the whole thing together. It was a stainless steel cover, kind of unique and very compact design in how it was built. Let's go ahead and look at one real quick, even though there are no rubber parts available. Here's the RP version. Here's the relief valve discharge right here. And there's the clamps where those shut-off valves would be pushed up there, sealed by that bolt in the center. Kind of unique. Anyway, they did have disassembly instructions on the back of this, because looking at this, a lot of people weren't sure exactly how it came apart. But how it came apart was this clamp right here. In other words, a stainless steel clamp, you'd loosen this nut. Once you loosen the nut, the clamp would come off from the top. Now, at this point, your first reaction is just to pull up on the cover. If you did, you'd end up breaking parts inside of it. You had to remove this air bleed, because that would release air to the top, and then once you pulled that out, now it would come off very easily. Again, once you got the cover off, still not sure what you're looking at. Anyway, if you'll notice there's a small little clip right here. You would squeeze the outside of this diaphragm retainer and pull up on it, and the relief valve stem would come out here, and the relief valve hose, which was attached right here. The relief valve sensing line was internal, meaning inside the backflow assembly. The check modules came out in one piece like this. They did have a rubber repair kit to rebuild them. They could also buy the checks separately, but they were a modularized check. And to rebuild the relief valve, you actually had to cut the relief valve hose, disassemble it. Relief valve seat, which pushes it here, and there's a relief valve disc. There were 2 discs and 2 seats, similar to what we saw in the Herson series of backflow assemblies, where it had a double relief valve disc and a double relief valve seat. But anyway, the 9-2929 RP 2-inch version is what you see here. No more parts are available. If you see them, you will have to. If it does have to be repaired, it will have to be replaced. But I wanted you to see this kind of a little footnote valve, because it's a little different than what we're used to seeing. So this is the 9-2929 Orion series of RPs.